So what we want to do today for our video lecture is the clock, right? And that's really what we're going to do in two videos. I'm going to show you guys how to, of course, send over again in this video. And we'll start to explore things like the stamps and incandescent maps and work a little more with layers. And then in the next video, we'll just kind of focus on finishing it up and bump maps. So in this case, I've got the clock, right? We've got the clock selected, and we're going to go File, and we're going to go Send to Mudbox, right? And we're going to send as new scene. Now, the nice thing is this one really, for my model particularly, is just one object, right? If you're using your models, it might be a little different because you might have a couple of the buttons separated, you might have a group. But if you're using the one I provided for you guys, I just simplified it a little bit, and it's just one object. So that one's going to be really easy to send over. So we go File, Send to Mudbox, Send as new scene. And this, of course, will open up Mudbox for us. So just going to give it a minute. And once it's over Mudbox, we'll just kind of close down Maya. There's no reason to have both open, right? They're both can be fairly RAM intensive. They're high-end software, right? High-end graphics software. So they can usually take up a lot of resources. So it's better to, if you can, kind of have just one or the other open, so that way more of your computer resources can be dedicated to that. All right, there we go, and it's just letting us know if you ever see something like this, a little warning, particularly if it says high valence vertex, that's really just letting us know there's a star kind of on that little cylindrical button. That's not really an actual error, and high valence vertex is really just another way to say star. So in this case, it's not really an error, and you'll just tell it to keep all, and it'll be fine. And you see it brings it in. There we go. Now, of course, you can see I'm kind of bringing this in from the actual scene. You guys don't have to do that, right? You can just kind of bring them in from the original scenes. It's not a problem. I'm just kind of showing you guys that it's easy to send one object. Now, if you ever see those little red dots, right, what you can do is you can go to the display menu. And in the display menu, you see kind of further down, there's a checkbox called Mesh Errors. And you can uncheck that so you don't see that. That's not really an error, right? Stars are sometimes necessary. You're going to have stars on certain models. On the top of a cylinder sphere, you're naturally going to have that. So that's not really an issue. Mudbox is just a little anal about that kind of stuff. So let me close down Maya really quick so we don't have to worry about it taking up all those resources. Give it a second. Come on, Maya, you can do it. There we go. And of course, before we even get far into this, let's just do a quick file, save scene as in Mudbox. That way we can kind of save this as clock. There we go. And sometimes you don't have to do it, sometimes you do. In this case, it's been telling me to kind of save as .mud, right? Even though it's technically should be doing that. It's kind of a little weird, but whatever. So there we go. And as usual, we're in Mudbox here, and I'll probably switch to my paintbrush, right? Down the paint tools, paintbrush. We want to create a star layer, right? And it's going to be good to do a color layer for that. So we just, of course, go up and make sure layers is on up here in the top right corner, paint's on. And we see there's those kind of 3 white pages. And we click on those, and that allows us to make a new layer. Now we'll call this, say, clock. Right, there we go. And 2048 is fine, right? We're just kind of keeping those defaults. But technically, you can go higher resolutions, different file formats if you want to. Diffuse channel, we'll hit OK. And there's our color layer. Now, this is our first color layer, right? It's our base layer. So it's always a good idea in your paintbrush, right, to pick a color. In this case, usually clock radios are pretty dark gray. So I'm actually going to kind of pick a pretty dark gray. Not exactly black, right? Believe it or not, very few things are actually true black. So kind of a quite dark gray will probably work better for this. We'll hit done. Remember, I just clicked on the little color chip, and you can kind of pick a color, hit done. And we can, of course, paintbrush is on, and it brings up the properties right here, so we can scroll down to flood paint layer. Click on that, and it floods that with that kind of dark gray for us, right? So there we go. We've got our base color there. Let's do a quick Control S to save. And what I want to do is I wanted to do a little bit of noise painting to this, right? But I don't really want to overpaint, where I want to be able to adjust this a little bit more freely, right? So in this case, instead of just painting some extra detail kind of right on this color, what I'm going to do is make a new layer, right? We haven't really done much with layers yet. So remember, you can make as many layers as you want. So I can go right back up to that new layer button, right? It's kind of those white 3 pages. Click on that. I'm going to call this clock noise, right? So it's good to kind of give a bit of a description just so the layers are kind of differentiated a little bit. They're labeled so you can kind of look at it and say, hey, that's the noise I wanted for the clock. So we'll hit OK for clock noise, and now we see there's a second layer. Now, in this case, what I want to do is I want to paint stamps, right? We've done stuff with stencils so far, and we're going to come back to using more stencils today and other projects. But I do like to use a little bit of stamps on this and the chair, because that's, I think, kind of where we're getting down to having to finish, because we've got most of our other stuff taken care of. There will be the room things as well, but that'll be pretty easy to take care of in later videos. So in this case, I click on Paintbrush, because whereas stencils need projection brush to work properly, stamps can work with the regular paintbrush. So I'm just going to click on regular paintbrush. I'm going to make this lighter color, so I'm going to go to color, and we'll kind of make this like a lighter gray. Maybe mid-gray should be fine. There we go. And I'm going to go to the stamps right here, right? Because in this case, I'm not actually going to use image browser to get to the stamps. There's actually some good presets in here that can be kind of cool for adding a little bit of noise. Now, one of the things that's different about a stamp versus a stencil is a stencil, you bring up the actual picture, and then you just kind of move your brush across that picture, and whatever is in the picture ends up on the model, right? Exactly as you paint it. Stamp is much more kind of taking this and kind of using it as a pattern that it will constantly repeat. It'll stamp down on the model, so it'll put like that image here, that image here, that image here, that image here. You know, it'll kind of keep stamping it down. Also, what it does is it uses the actual light and dark pixels of the image to paint with, right? So if there's any black pixels in your image, it won't paint that at all. It'll actually not paint whatever the color is there. So it's more like an actual real rubber stamp, right? You have those kind of old rubber stamps you can play with. You stick them in ink, and only the raised part gets the ink. All the part that's not raised won't get the ink. Black is basically like the non-raised part, whereas anything that's not black will actually be raised a little bit, or if it's closer to white or a lighter value pixel, it'll be show up even more. But it also kind of stamps, like I said, it stamps it down, right? So it's like it'll put the pattern, then the pattern again, and then the pattern again, kind of repeating itself. So if you're looking for an exact image like brick or fabric that's very recognizable, stencil's going to work way better for that. But if you're just kind of looking to add some kind of randomized noise, stamps can be great for that. So in this case, we can just use one of the pre-made stamps here instead of having to find our own stencils. So we can see that might be an interesting pattern right there. Maybe that one is. But there's lots of kind of interesting patterns here. I think this will kind of actually work pretty well for us. Now, one of the things to keep in mind about stamps, right, because you'll see once we click on Paintbrush and we go to the stamp menu here and we click on the stamp, it's using it, but you'll see there's something called stamp disting as part of its properties, or stamp spacing. And there's a distance. The lower the distance, the closer the stamp does, right? So if I start to paint, you see how it kind of does it right on top, right? It's all Control-Z to undo that. If I turn that stamp spacing up higher, right, the distance, you see how the stamp has further space. And so it can kind of make a noise that's a little bit less kind of overall on top, right? So I can do is I can just kind of start to paint this on here. It's kind of a great way to add a little bit of noise. So you can see stamp has a very distinctly different pattern. It's not painting the black at all that's in the image, and it's kind of repeating it like a stamp, right? Now, in this case, we have layers, right? So one of the things I can do is I can go to here. It says normal, right? It's kind of a little bit above. It's kind of right below paint. It says normal. I can click on this, and I could try it multiply. And you see how that actually gives it a very, very dark feel? It's almost a little too dark for me. So we might try screen or overlay, right? And overlay is a little too dark. So I'm kind of feeling like, maybe multiply was actually going to be a good one for us. But in this case, it just gives us a little bit of noise, right? Now, the thing is, you can even turn that down by making sure your opacity is a little lower. So maybe I'll have multiply on and just turn that strength down, right? The little slider here, just a little bit. You see it adds just a little bit of noise to it, right? And you'll notice that as I go and I keep painting with the stamp, the layer obeys itself, right? You see that it actually kind of adds a little bit of this effect. And so we can easily kind of come in here and kind of just paint kind of this extra little stamping. And so this is actually quite cool for kind of how we're going to stamp paint all this, right? It just kind of adds this little bit of noise to it. Because you often find there's kind of a little bit of noise to surfaces. And so I could easily play with the strength a little more. And you see if we turn the eyeball off, you can kind of see there is a subtle difference, a little bit of noise there, right? And like I said, if we wanted to, we could try different blend modes. Like you see color burn, it shows up even more. We could try color dodge, and that kind of shows up a little bit more. Actually, kind of like color dodge, maybe with a low level kind of transparency. There we go, low level strength. And so it just kind of adds a bit of noise to this. And it's a great way to kind of see that you have stamps and you have layers, and you can play with the blend modes and the strength, in this case, really transparency, opacity, right? And even stamp spacing kind of lets you space the stamp out so it doesn't stamp quite as close on top of each other. So that's how stamps can work, right? And of course we can go to stamp off, and then I'll turn it off. If there's a little bit too much of some stamping here, we can always kind of go to the paint erase. We can always kind of erase out a little bit, right? So we have paint erase there as well. And since it's on its own layer, right, we don't ruin the original. Now, in this case, what I want to do also is I want to, and you'll notice that the new layer I created, I didn't flood paint on, right? Because I really didn't want all of the stuff on there, right? I just wanted to paint a little bit of that, and I don't even need it fully opaque, right? That base layer is kind of the filled layer, right? So any layers above that, you don't have to flood paint on, right? You just paint what you want to paint. Now the last thing I really wanted to go over with you guys today, and we'll do some bump mapping, add some speaker stuff on the clock on the next video. But I wanted to show you guys how to use incandescent layers for glow, right? Now in this case, we're really going to kind of want to have, and this is where you're going to find like a better clock picture. I don't really have one right now, so I'll just kind of use a generic example, right? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer again. All right, so I'm a new layer. I'll call this clock face, right? There we go. All right, and this time I am going to use a stencil. So I'm going to go back to my projection brush, right? And then I'm going to go to image browser, and I'm going to go up one, right? Because when we're in image browser, I've kind of already clicked on this folder to kind of find and select the folder with all my textures in it. You can always go back and watch the other videos for that. But I can go up directories by clicking on the folder with the blue arrow, right? And then I can go in here and I can just find something that might work pretty well for kind of some computer screen stuff. In this case, I've kind of got these, and I'm going to use one of these just as an example. Obviously, you'll try to find an actual clock picture, or that's got the clock digit numbers. I don't have that on my computer, right? But the principle's the same, right? You would just use the proper digital display of a clock. So in this case, I'm just going to click on the white S to set that to stencil. It's there. Go back to 3D view, and it's showing up. Remember, sometimes if it doesn't, you just go back in the image browser and you click on white S again. Make sure that the on is on, right? And projection brush is on. So remember, S, right mouse button, could make this a lot smaller. All right, so I can kind of get the kind of stuff that I want right, say, about there. There we go. And of course, I can make my brush size smaller. B for brush, and then left mouse button to drag it down. Of course, you can click on projection brush to bring up the full controls for this again. You notice my color is white because I want to paint exactly as it looks. My strength is 100, right? So make sure your strength is high enough, right? So other than that, what I can do is I can start to paint. And now this is a color layer, right? So because we do want that color information. So I can just kind of paint this on here. There we go. Kind of just get it in there. Just kind of painting it on there. There we go. Now, in this case, now that I've painted this, right, you'll notice that there's a lot of other color missing, right? So in this case, I'm just going to turn my stencil off, right? Remember, you can go back to stencil here, turn it off. I'm going to go to paintbrush, and remember, one of the things that we can actually do is either through the color chip here, do an eyedropper, or we could even just do eyedropper here to kind of click on that black, right? That's right there. And you notice it goes right to paintbrush. B for brush to make my brush a little smaller. And you see we can kind of paint that same black. I'm going to turn stamp spacing off. There we go. And we can paint that exact same black for the rest of the clock face here, right? So it's kind of one of those neat things that you can do is you can sample colors, right? Quite easily just by eyedropper. And you could use kind of a color that's already in your stencil just to kind of paint that extra little bit. So you don't have to actually use every part of the stencil, right? So I'd kind of, in this case, I painted the whole stencil, but then I could kind of still paint on that layer just through eyedropper. You even see if you go to color checkerboard here, there's an eyedropper there as well that will allow you to kind of drop, right? So kind of cool little things like that that you can do to give us this. Now, in this case, I do want a flood painted incandescent layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create that first. So I'm going to go new layer, and we're going to call this glow. All right, we're going to call this clock glow, if I can spell correctly. There we go. In this case, I actually, unfortunately, did it right into diffuse. But remember, if you right-click on that layer, you can move selected to, and we can do what's called incandescence. And now this is actually a glow layer. Now in this case, I do want this to be the base layer. So I'm going to flood paint it. So I'm going to go to color, and we're going to make sure it is definitely on black, right? And we're going to scroll down, flood paint layer. And now we have a flood painted black layer for that, right? In this case, we picked black because black is off. It's 0%, right? With bump maps, we have kind of that 100, 0, negative 100. With most other map types, like incandescent map, black is really 0 and white's 100. Now we do have this clock face one that has that color there. So I want to duplicate this layer also. So I'm going to right click, duplicate selected, right? The other one I just moved to. I accidentally created it right as a diffuse. Remember, you can actually pick incandescent right from the new layer menu, right? But in this case, we kind of just moved it, right? I created it, moved it, flood painted it. In this case, I want to duplicate this layer, right? So I'm going to duplicate that one, so there's two. We can right click on it. Remember, when you right click on a layer, it brings up its options. And I just duplicated it, so I move selected to incandescence. Now, in this case, you'll see it's below the bottom one. So you'll left click drag it up above, and you see all of a sudden there's a lot more kind of brightness. It looks more like it's glowing. That's what incandescent maps actually do for us, right? They're actually glow maps. So incandescence basically means glow. You can make something look like it's a light source, right? So that's how we can start to build up our clocks. I'd probably do something more normal for a clock face, but you can see that this basically is exactly the same principle we use there, right? So there we go. That's probably a great place to end this video. So I'll stop there.